Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody for joining us today. This is the National Political Education Committee with DSA. We are hosting a panel session today for about 90 minutes. We're joined by three panelists, Luisa, Bill, and Vamsi. And today we'll be discussing the US and Mexico, the imperialist relationship between them. So I think let's start first with introductions. I'll hand it off to Luisa first, then Vamsi, then Bill to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to opening statements. So Luisa, if you'd like to kick us off.
Sure. I'll be brief. My name is Luisa. She, her pronouns. I'm a member of the Portland, Oregon DSA branch and currently elected to the NPEC. Just briefly, my background is in immigrants' rights, and homeless rights, labor in particular. I'm a full-time labor organizer. But currently I have and continue to work closely with the International Committee on DSA, and particularly in international solidarity. So I'm really happy to be part of this panel. Thank you very much for the invitation.
My name is Vamsi Vakulavaranam. I teach economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and I work on issues surrounding imperialism in South Asia and inequality in China and India. And I've also worked on agrarian issues in the context of South India. And I've also I'm about to publish a book on cities in the global South.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Vamsi. I'm Bill Gallegos. I live in Southeast Los Angeles in a great Black and Latino working class community called Linwood. I'm a member of Liberation Road, and I'm active in the Mexican Solidarity Project. Focus of most of my activism is around environmental justice, but my history is largely in the Chicano liberation struggle, beginning with the Crusade for Justice, the Brown Berets, La Raza Unida Party, helping to form the first Chicano Socialist organization, the August 29th movement. And I'm really very proud to be here today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us. So just so our audience knows, we have our chat closed so we can focus on our great panelists here today. However, we will have a Q&A period at the end of the call, so I definitely encourage you to submit questions throughout our session. So with that, let's kick things off. So we'll have some opening statements from our panelists to begin. Luisa, would you like to start?
So just remind me, how long are the opening statements?
About 12 minutes each.
Oh, so this is the presentation. Okay, so sorry, yes. My apologies. I got confused a little bit. No problem. So, okay. So I'm going to go first with my presentation, with my 12-minute presentation. Okay, my apologies. I'm just catching up. Okay, so so in order to understand imperialism, particularly within the context of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, you have to follow the money, right? And so I'll briefly talk about three things: NAFTA, U.S. immigration, right? I'm an immigrants' rights activist, and it was my academic focus. Also, I'm a formerly undocumented immigrant. I was undocumented for 16 years. And then now the war on drugs, right? And how that plays into U.S. politics. So NAFTA, famously, the North American Free Trade Act, the agreement, it offshored very famously almost 1 million U.S. jobs to Mexico, right? But you'll be shocked to learn that the agreement wasn't particularly great for Mexicans either. So one of the things that is most talked about, right, lots of ink has been spilled on NAFTA, right, is that very deep in kind of NAFTA lore is that it unloaded a bunch of U.S. corn into Mexico, which didn't really need corn, right? So Latin Americans love corn. Mexicans are no different. Very much a staple of the Mexican diet, right, in lots of dishes. And so NAFTA, opened the U.S. market to U.S. corn producers that are heavily subsidized by the U.S. government. We all know about, we're all familiar with this, right? High fructose corn syrup. It was probably in my coffee this morning. It's in our pores. It's probably in the room with us right now, right? Corn is everywhere. And so this led to, so you have United States dumping all this corn into Mexico, and then as a result of that, disappearing Mexican jobs. And so particularly small scale farmers, right, in rural Mexican areas. And so once you dumped all of that low cost corn into the Mexican market, Mexican corn prices fell 66%. And so you had, as a result of that, Mexicans going into factories, right, moving from the rural areas. And then, during that period in Mexican history, not being able, quickly discovering that mechanized labor did not pay anything to be able to, not at the scale to be able to feed your family. And so that's when we had more Mexican immigration to the United States, right? Economic immigration, economic asylum. And so just to give some historical context, NAFTA was signed in the United States by Clinton, but in Mexico, the Mexican president was President Salinas, right? He's a real piece of work, right? Went to Harvard, if you need to know anything else. But, he's widely regarded, he was head of the World Trade Organization, is widely regarded as the most unpopular president in Mexican history. So definitely didn't do anything for his legacy. And so, moving on to immigration, I will make a point that indigenous people in the Americas were colonized by Spain, right? Other European powers, of course, but for the broadly Spain, and then again by the United States, right? And then told to go home, right? So aside from the cruelty that's embedded in U.S. immigration policy and laws and stuff like that, it's exceptionally galling to be told to go home by Europeans, be told that you don't belong here. And so AMLO, the current Mexican president, Manuel López Obrador, he shared a corrido during one of his morning press conferences by a very famous band called Los Tigres del Norte. And the song was called Somos Más Americanos, right? And the rest of that is that we're more American than the gringos, right? Than the Anglo-Saxons and the Anglos. So I can share that in the chat. But, it wasn't always this way, right? The way that we understand immigration now is that, I'm sure, some of you have seen photos of people playing volleyball, right, on the US-Mexico border. And up until President Bush, right, baby Bush, Bush the painter, if you will, and President Obama, that migration from Latin America, not just from Mexico, but from Latin America was cyclical, that people would come to the United States, they'd work for a couple months, and then they'd go back, right? And so it wasn't until President Bush, again, he started with the deportation machine, and then it was really went off the scale with President Obama, where we started putting immigrants in jail, right? And so that really wasn't the case. What really happened, and again, before that, and what happened was private prison corporations, particularly two come to mind. One is Geo Group, the other one CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, that they realized that crime rate in the United States was actually going down, but they were concerned about their bottom line, and so they started lobbying Congress to criminalize immigration. This very much entered immigrants as criminals. The United States has historically been very racist towards immigrants, but it's really was kicked up when these corporations started lobbying Congress to create detention centers, right, which are just jails. They're just jails that just happen to be full of immigrants. And so that's when we saw the criminalization of immigrants, right? So Obama very famously often referred to as the deporter in chief. President Trump didn't reach the numbers that Obama did in terms of deporting people. And so that's why we saw the criminalization of immigration. So again, you have to follow the money. And so that kind of takes us to the war on drugs, right? And so and increasingly it being the case that U.S. politicians are talking about invading Mexico, right? This is another aspect. So just to be clear, the immigration is natural, the way that we've treated immigrants, the flood of Latin Americans into the United States, including Mexicans, right? is part of the byproduct of U.S.-Mexican imperialism, right? And so wrapped up in this is increasing narrative about invading Mexico. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that, large swaths of the United States were part of Mexico, were stolen. But more recently, this has entered kind of the lexicons, entered the public discussion. So U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, he revealed in his memoirs, it's like Trump, after people got fired or resigned, all these cabinet members and stuff like that under Trump, they all started writing these exposés, right? So he wrote that it's actually President Trump that had proposed that the United States conduct missile strikes on drug labs in Mexico, right? And so when we had President Trump, he was ready to designate Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations, right? And it was with his exchanges with President AMLO, you're threatening our diplomatic relations, like don't do this. He didn't do it. He didn't follow through with it. But again, this idea of invading Mexico continues. In April, it was reported that the United States had infiltrated the Sinaloa drug cartel, right? And this is all of this is couched in this fight against fentanyl, right? And so El Chapo's gang was infiltrated, but you can't do that without violating Mexican sovereignty. And so understandingly, AMLO was upset. He said, he blasted the U.S. for spying on the Sinaloa cartel without asking first, right? And so he described, the DEA's infiltration into Mexico as part of a larger effort to spy on the Mexican government. And he said, this is quote, "It is abusive, arrogant meddling that should not be accepted under any circumstance." That's what AMLO said. And so, you can't remove this talk about Mexico without mentioning the presidential elections, right? Earlier in the year, Congressman Dan Crenshaw and Mike Waltz, two Republicans from Texas and Florida, introduced the AUMF, which is the Authorization for the Use of Military Force Cartel Influence Resolution, right? Which is effectively a War Powers Act. It gives the U.S. president power to use necessary and appropriate force against foreign persons affiliated with foreign organizations, which is basically a pass to invade Mexico. Again, this is for specified drug-related offenses or used violence to control territory for illicit means. And so, it continues up until just 2 days ago. I sacrificed for all of you guys, and I watched the Republican primary debate, right? So Trump wasn't there. He started all this, but he wasn't there. But then they're always trying to outdo each other. And so, I can drop the link. Ramaswamy, he mentioned that, he's very much in favor of invading Mexico, using the smoke screen of the cartels as an excuse. And later DeSantis, right afterward, he's like, yeah, that's why I agree. I completely agree. And I will use U.S. military force to go after Mexican drug cartels. And so the question needs to be asked, why did this start, right? And why is the U.S. talking about invading Mexico? So again, this is consistent with U.S.-Mexico relations. I'm not going to go into the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, because for one thing, it was in 1848. It was a very long time ago. But I believe, now you're getting my perspective on it, that the point is to destabilize the Mexican presidential elections, right? So the U.S. government is threatened by AMLO, by President AMLO. He's received carried popular support, right? Over 60%, even through COVID, when everybody was angry. He's maintained a really high approval rating. He's decreased poverty in Mexico, right? The income gap has narrowed. The Gini coefficient has dropped. That's something that you follow. That's good. The lower the number, the better. And so you've seen a 17% rise in household incomes in the countryside. Rural areas are really important. If you really want to understand poverty and economics, you really look to the rural households, and there's been a rise in incomes because of all of the social welfare programs that have been started under AMLO and 4T, Fourth Transformation, And in overall terms, the poverty level has dropped in Mexico. It's been the lowest that it's been in 20 years. And so in addition to that, Mexico's ready to elect its first female president, right? But like a progressive woman, a woman of the left, Claudia Sheinbaum. And, it's very much the understanding that she'll continue the policies of 4T and of AMLO. And that's the threatening part to the United States, right? Is that just our neighbor has elected a government that's consistently been on the side of poor people, right? And that's the threat. That's the real threat of Mexico, right? Is our populace and our leftists like AMLO and what we've seen within 4T. So I'll stop right there. I'm out of time. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. So with that, we're going to move on to Bill. Bill, take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Luisa. That was wonderful. So I just want to say that if you want to find out more about my thinking on some of these topics, I have a paper called The Historical and Political Significance of U.S. Annexation of Mexico's Northern Territories, which I'm going to explore a little bit in my discussion here. Also, the Sun Belt Strategy and Chicano Liberation and the Struggle for Chicano Liberation. So folks are interested, they can contact me and I can put you in touch with that. So I should just say that I'm a proud child of New Mexico and Colorado. My familia are Gallegos, Maez, Benavides, Sanchez, Chavez, and Tapia. Both sides of my family were primarily farmers, people who had lived with land for generations, even before those areas were a part of Mexico. And like many other Chicano families, we lost that land, and my antepasados ended up working mainly in the coal mines of southern Colorado, including many of which were owned by the Rockefeller family. My grandfather and two of my tios, of my uncles, were miners who died of black lung-related illnesses. I'm very proud of my ancestors, not the least of which is because they were very active in helping to unionize the mines in New Mexico and Colorado. In fact, we had family at the Tin City in Ludlow, the site of the infamous Ludlow massacre in 1918, in which at least 21 people were machine gunned to death by a National Guard composed of hired thugs from Wyoming and Colorado. Many of those killed were women and children, and many were Chicano. So this is kind of some of the roots of my thinking and my political activism. I'm sharing this example from history not only as a source of great pride, which it is, but also because it helps to illustrate that it is impossible to understand the situation of the Chicano sector of the U.S. multiracial, multinational working class without understanding the impact of the U.S. annexation of Mexico's northern territories in the 1840s. In the mid to late 1840s, the U.S. waged a military campaign, several, against a very young and overmatched Mexican nation. And following the U.S. victory in those campaigns, it annexed the northern territories of Mexico, a landmass comprising nearly half of the land of the continental U.S. This conquest was a major factor in the United States becoming the dominant capitalist superpower that it is today, and a major factor in turning Mexico into a dependent nation of the global South, and with a semi-vassal relationship with El Gigante del Norte. With the theft of Mexico's lands, and the U.S. ruling class was able to extend a specific form of racial capitalism from sea to shining sea, able to greatly expand the white settler population, create a national rail infrastructure, develop a vast port complex to facilitate trade with the Pacific Rim, and reap the benefits of vast coal, oil, gas, gold, silver, copper, and other mineral deposits, and build an extensive agricultural industry in some of the most fertile land in the world. For Mexico, it was a case of pobre Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. U.S. capitalist interests rapidly penetrated the Mexican economy, establishing huge mining operations and financing the development of Mexico's transportation infrastructure to facilitate movement of goods and labor from the south to the north, which of course created a huge structural debt that Mexico still hasn't been able to pay. And to ensure Mexican compliance, the U.S. launched more than a dozen military operations into that country. And of course, Luisa just pointed out that is a familiar theme that we're hearing these days. And it's ironic that they want to do that because 75% of all the weapons in Mexico in the hands of the drug cartels come from the United States. This annexation also had a tremendous impact on the conquered Mexican population that lived in the annexed territories, a population primarily concentrated in what are today the states of Texas, New Mexico, and southern Colorado, Arizona, and California. This population was considered by the now dominant white population from the United States as a savage and backward dark people, lacking the intelligence and morality of the Euro-American population, which rapidly became a majority in the new territories. To consolidate its vast conquest, the U.S. ruling class established all of the major institutions, laws, and customs of Chicano oppression: massive land theft, segregated housing, language and cultural repression and oppression, educational segregation, very limited voting rights and political representation, police brutality, high rates of poverty, and the creation of the Mexican rate, a lower rate of pay for Chicano working in the fields, mines, and factories than was paid to white workers. There was also just the horrible brutality. We're familiar, a lot of us, with the lynching that took place against the Black folks in the South, but folks don't realize how common that was also in the conquered areas of the Southwest. And it's estimated that up to 5,000 Chicanos were lynched by Texas Rangers in Texas alone. For the conquered people, U.S. racism and white supremacy prevented them from assimilating as equals into the dominant Euro-American or white population, as was later possible for successive waves of European immigrants. And it also prevented them from developing as citizens of the evolving Mexican nation. The U.S. conquest was met with tremendous resistance from the conquered indigenous and Mexican populations, a resistance that included significant armed uprisings. The convergence of all of these factors resulted in something not actually unique in the era of imperialism, the creation of a new nation, a Chicano nation and a national liberation movement that continues to this day. The Chicano people today comprise a population of nearly 40 million, the largest oppressed nationality in the U.S., a population whose vast majority live in the areas of their historic concentration: Texas, New Mexico, southern Colorado, Arizona, and California. We are an overwhelmingly 85% working class population, a reality largely due to an oppressive system which denied us equal access to education, political representation, the academy, the professions, business opportunities, etc. So as a primarily working class population, we've had a very, very active role in both the labor movement and in other areas of democratic struggle. But Chicano workers were a major component of the wobbly efforts, especially in California, where the IWW worked to unionize farm workers and other agricultural-related workers, like in the canneries. Chicano workers played a major role in unionizing the coal and copper mines in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Communists also played a major role in Chicano labor struggles. In 1938, communist organizer Emma Tenayuca led a militant strike of pecan shellers in San Antonio. And all of us are familiar, of course, with the struggle of the United Farm Workers, which was the first successful effort to take on U.S. agribusiness. But I don't want to focus only on a narrowly defined labor role for Chicano workers, because the Chicano working class has played a huge role in every area of democratic struggle, whether that's for access to higher education, to credit for small and medium-sized businesses, for voting rights, for political representation, and for access to art and culture, to the expression of our art and culture. And just, so much of this is, we're familiar with the Teatro Campesino, which was a theater organization which flourished to support the United Farm Workers, but which gave to a rise of over 100 teatros throughout the Southwest. The music of a lot of the seminal Chicano music is largely rooted in the working class communities. The music of Little Joe and La Mafia in Texas, of Roberto Griego in New Mexico, of Los Lobos in California, all of them with working class origins. So the Chicano working class has played a role in the broader liberation struggle. Yes, it was for unionization. Yes, it was for labor rights, but it's also for equality in all sectors of society, and actually for the national rights. The struggle for the land is an ongoing struggle in New Mexico. We're all familiar with the uprising of La Alianza in New Mexico, led by Reyes Lopez Tijerina. But few people know that the response of urban Chicanos was overwhelming. Caravans from Chicago, from Los Angeles, from San Francisco, from Denver, from all these urban areas, because we had become an overwhelming urban population. And that's not just because we love our papas and our chiles, but because of what that land struggle represented, because of the annexation. So there's a tremendous lack of understanding generally in the US left about the Chicano struggle and about Chicano liberation. And I'm really that's why I'm so appreciative of this webinar. And we can see the impact of this population. The uprising in 2006, I was at the demonstration that we had for immigrants' rights in 2006. There was over 1 million people there. But that mobilization in 2006 mobilized upwards of 2 million people from the East Coast to Chicago, which has one of the largest Chicano-Mexicano populations outside of Los Angeles. Throughout the Southwest, there were massive demonstrations. And sadly, very little of that has been documented by the US left, what that represented and what that meant. And those were overwhelmingly working class. And unfortunately, what happened to that struggle in 2006 represents the class struggle within our own movement, because that movement, what happened to it? It was decapitated by the more privileged sectors of our movement, which said, go back to work, quit walking out of schools. We'll handle it in Washington. We have our lawyers, we have our lobbyists. And of course, they got their assets handed to them. But I think it demonstrates again the importance of organizing Chicano working class Chicanos to have their own voice, to assert their own class interest in all of these struggles. And I just want to say that this is also represented in more recent times in the electoral arena, where Chicano voters ensured the defeat of Trump and of the Republicans in Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and California. Without our voting, the Republicans win all of those states. Trump wins all of those states. So there's a significant impact that this population has had. And this is important from the standpoint of strategy. And I want to say that, just in terms of connection to the Mexicano workers, of course, because the border has been so fluid, the Chicano population has been increased over the years with immigrants from Mexico who have come back, who have returned home to this conquered territory. But when they get here, what happens? They're not able to assimilate like the Italian immigrants and the Irish immigrants. They are not able to assimilate with the dominant population. So where do they assimilate? They live in the same neighborhoods that we live in, the same barrios. They go to the same schools that Chicanos go to. They suffer the same segregation and discrimination in housing and healthcare and voting rights, and from police brutality with the added dimension of the brutality of the migra. So their assimilation happens with this conquered population. This is an important thing to understand. This is very, very important to understand, because some people reduce the Chicano liberation struggle as primarily a struggle for immigrants' rights, and it's much broader than that. The end point of our struggle is not a mica, it's not a green card, it's not naturalization, it's our national rights, it's self-determination. So this is very important, and Chicanos have always been, really connected to the struggle in Mexico. So a lot of Chicano workers and their unions opposed the NAFTA agreement. They were very strongly opposed to the agreement of NAFTA in 1994. That's why the support from our side of the border for Zapatistas was so strong, because the source of the Zapatista uprising was the day NAFTA went into effect. But the Chicano business class, the emerging Chicano business class, overwhelmingly supported NAFTA, because they thought, we got a new market now. We're going to have new business opportunities. So there was a class dimension to the response to NAFTA from the overwhelmingly Chicano working class and from its business sector. Very, very different. So I want to just say a little bit too about, there's one of the things that's going on now is that there are chapters of the Morena party throughout the Southwest. We have, 8 or 9 or 10 in Los Angeles alone. This connection with what's going on in Mexico is extremely strong and very, very important, of course, because a lot of folks on this side of the border can vote in the Mexican elections. So they become a part of that important electoral struggle. But I think there's also a recognition of how significant the Morena experience is to challenge. When you challenge the Mexican oligarchy, you're challenging U.S. imperialism, because the U.S. imperialism has been the primary source of political and financial and economic support for the Mexican oligarchy. So that there's a recognition of how important this experiment that is going to go beyond AMLO. It is a very, very important political experiment, and not only for Mexico and not only for Chicanos on this side, but for this emerging pink tide in Latino America. That pink tide is important. All of the countries, of course, are important and precious in that, whether it's Venezuela or Bolivia, or now Ecuador or Chile. They're all extremely important. But two countries stand out as potentially anchoring this populist anti-neoliberal experiment, and that's Brazil and Mexico. If the experiment in Mexico is successful and is consolidated and can grow, it's important not only for the people of that country, first of all, and los pobres, and for the people on this side of the border, but for this emerging anti-imperialist wave, anti-neoliberal wave that is happening nowhere else in the world. And for that reason alone, the solidarity that we need to build with the movements in Mexico, not just Morena, but with Morena as well, are extremely important for our own effort to transform our society. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Bill. So for that, we're going to move on to Vamsi. But before we do, I want to remind folks that they can submit questions at any point. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom call that if you hit that, you should be able to submit questions, and we'll get to answering some of them at the end of the call. But let's move on to Vamsi now.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks for those very interesting presentations from Louisa and Bill. So I was invited to present on this panel to talk about imperialism in general, the conceptual vocabulary of imperialism. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pose 5 or 6 questions, and I'll try to answer these questions. So the first question, the obvious question is, what is modern capitalist imperialism? And this has been defined in multiple ways by non-Marxists like John Hobson in 1902. And then it was picked up by Marxists like Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Bukharin, Kautsky in the early 20th century, and then Samir Amin and Emmanuel in the middle of the 20th century. And then, in our times, there have been people like Giovanni Arrighi or David Harvey or Ellen Meiskins Wood. The term got popular, when thinkers were trying to understand the scramble for African colonies by European powers after 1880s. So this is almost, now the term has a history of more than 120 years, and it was applied to the scramble for African colonies that started in the 1870s, 1880s. So in all these definitions, 2 different processes come together in modern capitalist imperialism. One process is that of capitalist expansion, and the second process is that of territorial expansion. And they usually reinforce each other, capitalist expansion and territorial expansion, but they could also undermine each other during certain periods. So in this brief presentation, I define imperialism in the following sense. It's the direct or indirect economic and political domination over the people of a nation or a region by another nation state and its ruling class, ruling capitalist class typically. This domination is exercised in order to obtain economic benefits like extracting natural resources or extracting agricultural products, or to get access to markets in the dominated country, or to get higher profits by exploiting workers in the dominated nation, right? So those are the broad objectives. This is in addition to exercising political and cultural dominance. I focus mainly on the economic aspects in the rest of my very brief presentation, and to a lesser extent on the political aspects. So to quickly talk about the political aspects of imperialism, it ranges from a direct control by force, but it could also be indirect control by offering protection from other powers, or through the incorporation of nations and countries into a strategic network by offering them various kinds of aid, both of an economic kind and a military kind. So that those would be the political aspects. So that's the first question. The second question is, what are the driving forces of imperialist domination? What drives imperialist domination? Typically, the imperative of economic expansion comes from an inability to sustain capitalist expansion within the confines of the national economy or the imperial economy, or alternatively, due to a strong imperative to increase the pace of capitalist expansion compared to the prevalent level. So the first part of the definition, is hinting at, crises of capitalism. So there have been two kinds of major crises over the last, 150, 175 years in capitalism. The first kind of crisis is a profitability crisis, where, capitalist profits, go down during a certain period. It could also happen because of increased worker strength, but that is not the only reason. In the imperial nations, and, an attempt to find a solution for this, externalizes people, right? Externalizes, the capitalist class and its expansion into other countries. Or the second kind of crisis, which has been very big over the last 150 years, is demand crisis. There's not sufficient demand in the imperial nation for all the products that are being produced. And typically, demand crises are accompanied by rise in inequality. For instance, what has happened in this country over the last 50 years, right? Post-1970s, inequality levels have risen tremendously. And the poor, do not have enough, purchasing power to create adequate demand. So that creates an impetus to go into some other space, external space, and dominate other countries and sell your products in other countries. So both these kinds of crises, profitability crises as well as demand crises, have played an important role. The third question is, how does the ruling class of an imperialist power benefit from imperialism? So the various ways, I'll just outline, 6 ways, and we can also add or subtract, in the Q&A session. The first way in which the ruling class can benefit is by it extracts natural resources from dominated territories that are used then as raw materials for capitalist production in the imperialist core. That is the first thing. The second, benefit for the ruling class is the dominated countries and their economies could be used as markets for goods that are produced in the imperial countries. Third, capitalist classes in the imperial countries can export capital to the dominated countries so that it can access cheap labor, low-wage workers at the destination, and extract much higher profits than what they could, in the imperial country itself. 4, it can lead to a process of accumulation by force or through disposition, whereby, peasant properties or collective properties or state properties can be annexed or controlled by imperial capital or its agents in the dominated territories. It can also lead to, during colonial times, it can also lead to a direct transfer of tribute from the dominated territories to the imperial countries. 6, it can lead to a process of unequal exchange. This is something that people like Samir Amin worked on, whereby the producers of the dominated country transfer value to the imperialist core without being compensated through international trade and exchange and things like that. Now I move on to the fourth question. How is the working class in an imperialist power affected by imperialism? Something like, how are US workers affected by, US imperialism? Working classes within the imperialist countries can have a complex and contradictory relation to the logic of imperialist expansion. They could benefit or they could lose, depending on the relation between workers and capital, capitalist class. For example, just to give you 2 quick instances, US workers benefited from American imperialism between 1950 and 1970s, the increased rents. Some of it was given as higher wages to workers. So, workers here were somewhat silent during that period about US imperialism. Not always, not all groups, but, a significant chunk of, the, working people were not particularly, critical of US imperialism. But then post-1970s, especially starting in 1980, US workers lost significantly because US capital externalized itself, went all over the world, in the process retrenching workers here, causing wage declines. So So, if you look at the last 75 years, there are two phases. In one phase, the workers benefited. In another phase, workers lost out. How does imperialism affect a dominated country and its people? That's the fifth question. And imperialism is, as the first two presentations also showed, it's fundamentally destructive and violent in its impact on the dominated country. But it can also have a complex relation. So what are the destructive processes? One, there's an extraction of resources, which is a transfer of wealth from the dominated territory to the imperial country. They're used as, these economies of the dominated territories are used as markets for finished products that could decimate local production, right? I mean, you take over the markets, then, the impetus for local production of the same commodities dies. The local producers don't emerge. There is a destruction of local autonomy, of these economies and the popular will. What do people want for themselves? An imperialist kind of aggression would destroy that. But during certain temporary and exceptional phases, it can also contribute to accelerated growth in the dominated territory. For instance, the case of China between 1980s and 2010, where a lot of external capital went in. That was not the only factor, though. That was one of the factors that contributed to accelerated Chinese growth. And it did not always benefit all the Chinese people, but it contributed to accelerated growth. And I think that also applies broadly to the Indian case. The last question, and I'll stop with this: can imperialist relationships cause problems for the ruling class in the imperialist power itself? There are three possible ways in which imperialist relationships can cause problems for the ruling class. The first is, of course, workers in the imperialist country can protest and can lead movements against the imperialism of its own ruling class. Second, workers and ruling classes in the dominated countries could rebel and fight the ruling classes of the imperialist countries. And broadly, this could lead to various resistance movements across the world that could destabilize the ruling class of the imperialist powers. So these are the various routes through which imperialist relationships are not always unchecked. There are possible ways of pushing it back, and it has happened throughout the history of capitalism. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to our three presenters here. So we're going to just take some quick follow-up questions from me, and then we'll move into the Q&A section. I see we have a bunch of questions coming in. If you have not submitted a question, definitely do so now, or start thinking about sending one in before we reach that period. So let's hop back over to Luisa real quick. I wanted to ask you about DSA's work, the International Committee's work. How does DSA relate to Mexico, organizing happening there? And let's just talk a little bit about the work that's going on or we can expect in the near term.
Sure. A couple months ago, we did a webinar kind of addressing some of the media narratives. This was, I think it was back in April, something like that. And so, I was noticing just this onslaught of anti-AMLO narratives in English press, right? And so we did a webinar on that, basically. But recently, I know that we've teamed up with the Mexico Solidarity Project to we'll be co-sponsoring a tour by a journalist. His name's Jose Luis, who's actually a member of the webinar that I just referenced earlier. Let me go ahead and cut and paste that. And so it's going to be in the same vein, like just kind of getting at the fake news that we hear, again, in English language media about AMLO, about Cuatro T. He'll touch somewhat on the war on drugs and stuff like that. And so I can go ahead and drop that in the chat now. But that's really exciting, and that's going to happen. That's really recent. Once I figure out how to cut and paste it, I think it's too big. I will share it in the chat. But that's what I have to report.
Excellent. Thank you. Bill, I wanted to touch on some of the things that you were talking about, especially as regards labor organizing and the current crisis that we're seeing, or that the media, kind of like Luisa was saying, is reporting on in regards to immigration. So talking about like something like the UAW strike, which is seen something of like an internationalist kind of solidarity, how do we rebuild some of that energy that you were talking about that has historically existed in recent times and far in the past? How do we start building that movement back up, both like locally and more broadly as an international perspective?
Right, that's a good question. Before I get into that, I just want to touch on a little bit of what Luisa was saying about the coverage of what's going on in Mexico. And I think that extends a lot to the US left as well. And it bothers me because a lot of it is very one-sided, but it also reflects kind of, in my mind, kind of an arrogant thinking that North American leftists know better than the people of Mexico or the people of Venezuela or the people of Cuba. That's an unfortunate tradition on much of the US left, and I see that very much reflected in the way people are addressing some of the situation in Mexico very one-sidedly. And anyway, so I just want to get that off my chest here. In terms of the labor struggle, I think the best thing is a lot of direct contact. So what the Mexican Solidarity Project is doing, I think, is really, really important to try to share information, what's going on here on this side of the frontera and what's going on over there to a broader population here. Now, we focus a lot here, primarily on the Latino population, but trying to get it out to a broader section to understand what is going on in Mexico, and also for people in Mexico to understand what's going on here. I think these direct contacts, like bringing UAW strikers to Mexico, to some of those areas, those auto plants for workers in the newly independent unions in Mexico are trying to get a contract where they've organized these independent unions. I think we need to kind of go old school on a lot of this. I think we got to build like what happened when the Zapatista uprising. There were caravans that went to Chiapas, and there were people from Chiapas coming to this side of the border. I think we have to do a lot of that kind of work. I think we need to use social media. I think we have to have more and more webinars of this kind. I think we got to do some things that use a lot more art and cultural as a means of reaching people. But I think we have to begin to actually have cross-border communication, cross-border presence of folks on this side of the border from our working class struggles and union struggles here, and bringing people from Mexico to this side so they can really begin to engage and build those relationships directly. They're very energizing, and they begin to build, I think, lasting ties beyond a one-off event.
Thanks, Bill. And then Vamsi, one follow-up for you. You spoke a lot about the different aspects about the imperialist relationship between nations, and in particular as it relates to labor and resource extraction. How do you see the terrain potentially changing in the near future? Something that had been touched on is, talking about invading Mexico, which is like a very big escalation of the rhetoric that's been talked about or that's been used in recent times. So how do you see that dynamic between the two countries and their respective working classes changing in the years ahead based on what we're seeing now?
So, I'm not really an expert on, US-Mexico relations. And, I do a lot of my work on South Asia and China, on the East Asian region. But in general, if you take the, global capitalism, right? I can make a comment, in the immediate future. I think we are moving towards a more contested global space, right? We have already moved into a more contested global space compared to, let's say, the post-1991 period, when Soviet Union collapsed. And, it seemed like a unipolar world. But, now, there are other players like China and other countries that have entered the arena, and, they're beginning to contest, the existing global capitalist space. So the reactions from, the US imperialism, US ruling class has been to assert its power, its territorial logic, its territorial power on the one hand. And, on the other hand, there's also an attempt to look inward, right? So there are both those responses, at this point in time in the US, right? There is the whole America first kind of an argument. But at the same time, it's not followed through with policies that actually, go with that sort of a position. So at the broadest scale, I think, there is increased contestation. So I think, U.S. Imperialism cannot proceed in an unchecked way. So in that sense, there is a greater possibility in the global space for contestation. And I think that would also apply to US-Mexico relations. And this is something to watch out for. So I'm giving you a very broad answer, to a very concrete question.
Thank you. All right, so with that, let's move into our Q&A period. We have some really good questions here. Some of them I'll ask generally, and the panelists can answer as they see fit, or some of them are asked specifically to specific panelists. So one of the questions that we have is, how successful is the independent union movement in Mexico, and how can we support it? And I'll leave that to the panelists to answer.
Luisa, do you want to speak to that, or?
No, go ahead.
No. Well, this is something new. So we know that the ZM has been very much aligned with the Mexican oligarchy, the existing union movement in Mexico for years with the PRI and later with the PAN. So one of the, I think, really important achievements of the Mexican working class and through AMLO and Morena is the recognition of the right to form independent unions. They're new, and they've won some important victories against, especially against automakers. But very similar to here, they win the right to unionize, and then the struggle around securing a contract becomes exceedingly difficult and protracted. And as we know here, that can sometimes lead to demoralization and problems. What I think is really critical here is support, for example, from the United Auto Workers Union, but from even broader than that, from the U.S. labor movement for these independent labor efforts. And I think that means, one, making them people aware on this side of the border of what's going on and why they're significant, and then actually building paths for solidarity, raising money, delegations, caravans, bringing folks over this side of the border to help build support and awareness about those struggles. So I think that's the kind of work that it takes. And it's a new movement, it's nascent, but I think it's because it has support, at least legislatively, from the Morena party. I think that's good. I would like to see the government speak. I mean, I thought it was good when Joe Biden walked the picket line for the UAW strikers out here. I think it would be wonderful for AMLO to more directly show support for some of these independent union movements in Mexico.
I would like to add something briefly. So the last time, so I definitely echoing what Bill said, it's a very small movement, right, of independent unions. And there has been criticism that AMLO has not engaged with them enough. On the other hand, it does need to be recognized that they are small, right? And probably not, in AMLO's perspective, one of the more important groups that he has to negotiate with, right, and interact with. I'll just give you an anecdote. Last time I was in Mexico, I got invited to a get together of these activists within these independent movements, and we just had a conversation just to give some context about how labor unions function. So I've helped organize 8-9 strikes at this point, and so we were explaining what the process was, right? And so for at least in the state that I live, with the groups that I organize with, it's pretty simple, right? Most of it has to do with just respecting the union's bylaws when you go on strike, right? But there's a notice requirement. Sometimes we follow it, sometimes we don't. For the most part, the strike really gets settled, right, during the settlement agreement, right? We make sure that there's no retaliation, that nobody loses pay, et cetera, et cetera. The conversation I had with them is a very complicated process to go on strike. It involves a heavy hand of the state, and it's just more difficult to do those things, right? And this has historically been embedded. This was long before AMLO. So just organizing, just again, the the influence of the state and to do something as simple as strike, right, is very much a part, one of the obstacles that they face. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. We had one of our people in the audience mention that nobody had spoken much about the Zapatistas and other non-electoral and indigenous struggles in Mexico, nor about the distribution of the Chicano population inside the U.S. outside of the Southwest to the Midwest, about 1 million in Chicago and Southeast like Atlanta, New Orleans. So could one of you speak to non-electoral movements outside of the labor space, more talking up to the indigenous struggles or looking at like the Zapatistas, forgive me. And also, what do people think are the prospects for a revolutionary struggle in Mexico and its impact within the US as occurred from 1910 to 20 with the Mexican Revolution?
Well, I'll just speak to the Chicanos who live outside of the historic areas of concentration, like in Chicago, a huge population there. It's very similar to, that's why annexation is so important, that understanding what that means. As we know, for African Americans, whether you're in the South, like Malcolm said, if you're south of the Canadian border, you're South if you're Black. That means the legacy of slavery follows African Americans everywhere. So when they migrated out of the South into the Midwest and into California, they continue to face racism and oppression and inequality. That's the legacy of slavery that has not been resolved. Similarly for us as a conquered people. So for folks in Chicago, their situation is very, very similar to Chicanos everywhere. Poor barrios, poor schools, poor health access to healthcare, language and cultural oppression, issues related to political representation and voting rights. They've had to fight every inch of the way for those things. So it's for those populations. There's the oppression that was put in place after annexation is our legacy. It's our imperial legacy, and so there's. And especially as the Chicano movement developed, there was a lot of connection with folks outside of the concentrations in the Southwest and California in the Southwest. A lot of connections through art and culture, through student movements, through labor, through the network of newspapers that developed. Chicano Press Association had over 100 newspapers, including several in Chicago. So there's, I think that's why we see a similar situation, but also there's very unique conditions in the Midwest that are different from, there's not big agricultural sector like we have here in California or they have in Arizona. But that legacy remains dominant for any Chicano or Mexicano population that lives in this country. That's why even if you're in Chicago, you don't get to follow the path of the Irish immigrants or the Polish immigrants or the Italian immigrants. That path to assimilation and equality in the white population is not available.
Lisa, would you like to add anything to that?
Not the only thing that I'll add is that the way that minority groups in the United States have been able to have economic prosperity is really with aligning themselves with whiteness, right? And very clearly, that's not the case with Mexicans, right? Just recently, again, 2 days ago, talking about invading Mexico, and historically, Trump's comments about Mexicans, which I won't repeat. It just doesn't, like Bill said, it's just not available, right? That's how Irish, Italians became white in the social imagination. That wasn't always the case. It's really getting away from Blackness and really being identified as white. It's a deliberate it's a deliberate decision, right? It's a deliberate political maneuver. But that's I absolutely agree with Bill. It's not really anything that's available to Mexicans.
I just want to say a little bit about the Zapatistas. I mean, I just think as those of us on the North American left, we should support all the social movements in Mexico, including the Zapatistas. And we know that there's going to be contradictions like we have here on our left and within and among social movements. I think we have to be very careful about not designating the Zapatistas are the real and the Morenistas are the bogus. You know, that's for the Mexican people to resolve how those contradictions should be resolved. I think our responsibility here is to oppose our imperialism, which is the primarily responsible for the dependency and the global south status of Mexico, and do all that we can, like people have done, to support the Zapatistas, and now, you know, what's positive in the Morena movement. But I know that there are those contradictions. The Zapatistas do not represent all the indigenous people in Mexico, but they represent a very important sector, and there are divisions, of course, within that movement as well.
Vamsi, the next question I have is for you. Could you speak a little bit to how you understand Mexico's development as a global South country within this imperialist relationship and compared to other dynamics? Something else that had come up is, you know, China, whether that constitutes being an imperialist, sub-imperialist power, kind of, I guess, in a sense related to Bill, what he was talking about with whether we regard movements to be authentic, who decides those things, how do we make those judgments, who does it? Because I know your specialty is in a different region. So how do we kind of connect the dots there with Mexico, you know, not being an imperialist power in the way that the United States is, the economic development happening there, and then comparing it to other countries that are state capitalist or otherwise socialist?
So, I mean, again, from a distance, because, you know, this is not something that I study carefully, you know, from my own readings or, you know, from whatever I've listened to, you know, about Mexico, I think, you know, it's very much like a, you know, a dominated country, you know, that is similar in many features to, you know, African countries or Asian countries. So in that sense, you know, there is, you know, the mechanisms that I identified, you know, for how imperialism operates. I think, you know, they operate very well in the context of Mexican economy, Mexican people as well. So, so that is the broad answer to your question. But since you raised the question of China, you know, it's a you know, at this point in time, there, you know, while China is also extracting natural resources and so forth from various parts of the world, there is no clear evidence of any political domination on the part of China. So, you know, I don't want to go into great detail because it's a completely different topic, but I don't see, you know, China as being imperialist at this point in time. But it's a, but the emergence of China has created, I think, more, you know, space for countries to contest the existing imperialism or US imperialism. So, so that is the, that's how I would think about it, you know, and, you know, we could definitely have a discussion, contestation beyond this.
Thank you. Another question that we have from our audience. The GOP rhetoric of a military invasion of Mexico is obviously horrifying. I'm assuming that the ruling class that controls the US government wouldn't let that happen as long as there's money to be made by US imperialism in Mexico. On the other hand, having leadership in Mexico that seeks to support and care for the populace threatens US imperialism. Can anyone speak more to that balance? For example, to what degree the Mexican president's hands are tied from, quote, going too far? And even worse, at what point would the wealthy class allow the US government to invade Mexico?
I think it's hard to say. You know, they could use the Colombia model. I don't think AMLO's going to allow something like that, or the Morena party would allow something like that. But in Colombia, they didn't invade, but they sent special forces over there to work with the Colombian military and the death squads, supposedly as part of the war on drugs. So, you know, I'm very concerned about how this is all going to play out in the 2024 national elections, because all of the Republican Party seems to be completely aligned with ethnic cleansing of all undocumented immigrants in this country, complete militarization of the border, and even invasion and military action against Mexico. the leadership of the Democratic Party often responds to this in a very defensive way. Yes, we support the Dreamers, but we're going to really build up the border patrol and the militarization of the border and put pressure on Mexico on both issues of immigration and the war on drugs. So I'm very, very concerned about politically how this is going to be advanced in this coming period in the national elections. And I think it makes it even more important for us over here to be, especially for the left. And I think is one of the things I really love about this is that this is demonstrating left unity, which I think is really essential and precious right now. So over this next period of time, we can really advance a narrative that's truthful and honest about U.S. relations with Mexico, cross-border solidarity, the truth about immigration and the source, the imperialist source of the immigration movements that drive people to this country. I think that's really going to be very, very important. I think the threat of, I think we should assume, just given U.S. history with Mexico, that the threat of military action is always possible. But I just think with a Morena government, I think that's unlikely to happen.
And
at least directly.
Sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
Sorry, Luis, I was just still spouting off. Sorry.
Oh, my bad. Okay. So what was I going to add about that? So I'll give you an example to which, but you're very much getting Luis's opinion about this, right? He's tempered. So AMLO has consistently challenged U.S. imperialism, at least, in terms of rhetoric, right? So like one of the big examples we give is AMLO, not sending anybody to the OES conference, right? He said, I'm not going because you haven't invited Venezuela, you haven't invited Maduro, you didn't invite Cuba, you didn't invite Nicaragua. All right, so that's one example of him challenging it. But recently he's spoken out. For instance, he'll visit Cuba and Venezuela, but he won't visit like Nicaragua, right? And so that's one way that he's kind of tempered it. Sometimes he'll omit commentary on certain countries, on certain situations and stuff like that. But he will take a chance, for instance, with Cuba. He said very, very strongly that the Cuban blockade, the blockade against Cuba is inhumane, and it's definitely something that the United States should end. So people read into it, right? So it's like, okay, well, why didn't he go to Nicaragua? Oh, he's making some commentary about Nicaragua. It's like, no, I think he's just choosing his battles, not everything all at once. And one thing that I've heard other commentators say is that he's deliberately not chosen the path of Hugo Chavez, right? Who has, in terms of being a critic of U.S. empire, has been probably one of the loudest voices historically. I'll be clear, I'm a Chavista, right? I love the fact that, Hugo Chavez said, like, he said at the UN meeting once, he's like, oh, I smell sulfur, saying after the US president, Bush had just spoken, right? That the devil was here and stuff like that. AMLO's probably not going to say that. For one thing, he's that's not his personality. But then I also believe that it is a deliberate political tool, that he's not going to engage in the same kind of rhetoric that Hugo Chavez has. Right, that's just his style. That's just the choices that he's made. But I would still defend that he still consistently he has challenged empire, maybe just in different ways.
Thank you. I think, oh, Bill, do you want to add something?
Well, I just want to say that I agree completely with Luisa, and I think we also have to recognize how vulnerable the Mexican economy, when they say they're going to shut it down and cut off all trade, that could really tank the Mexican economy. And I think AMLO and the leadership of the Morena Party very aware of that. And I think have to tread very, very carefully to not go into an all-out conflict with the US if it can be avoided. I think we have to try to understand that here.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we close things up for today. So I have a follow-up for Luisa. What are some of the ways that Mexico is exerting its sovereignty? What can we do to support some of these efforts, such as nationalizing its energy sector or banning GMO corn, that the US is challenging?
Oh, what a beautiful serve up to invite people to join DSA, and particularly the International Committee. So we have a thriving group on Mexico. Like I said, we are working with Jose Luis on that tour that I posted the dates for. If you live in any of these cities, please show up. And then we can you can talk more with the organizers there. We have the elections coming up, right? Really, really important that the left in the United States do these kinds of events to counter the narrative that we're going to get from English language media about how terrible Claudia Sheinbaum is, or all of AMLO's mistakes, which he has made, but they've been very much distorted by English language media. And yeah, definitely get involved with the International Committee, and of course the Mexico Solidarity Project, which we've paired up with. So I'll drop those links too.
All right, and I think we have time for one more question. I guess this is kind of like a good way to kind of shift towards the end of our call, kind of, revisiting a question asked earlier, but answering it more directly. What are the prospects for revolutionary struggle in the moment that we're in? I know that we had touched here and there on this topic and in different ways. But, specifically speaking to in Mexico, its impact within the US, and then, taking the history and looking contemporaneously, like what the moment that we're in, what possibilities exist. And I think this is a good question for all three panelists to try and answer.
Well, I'd just say, we have to keep in mind how new the Morena experiment is. It's a young party, and it has to both govern effectively and consolidate and grow. So it's got to really, it's got to build the car while it's driving, or whatever the metaphor is. And as a successful party, which has won overwhelmingly at local, regional, national elections, a lot of opportunists are jumping into the party. I will help you set up your public education system in this pueblito. I would like to run for office as a Morena candidate. So they're having to deal with a lot of complicated issues about how they, first of all, govern effectively, because they're the governing party. They have to govern effectively. And I think they've done a good job of that. But at the same time, they have to consolidate their ranks, and they have to grow. They have to develop new leadership. So they don't, they're the people that at least I've met from the Morena party said, we're not a socialist party. We're not a revolutionary party. We're an anti-neoliberal party. We're a populist party. And we really, this is a party that really wants to meet the needs of the people, govern in favor of the people, especially the poor, and stand up to the United States. But they're not working for that kind of revolutionary transformation that we understand as is necessary and is what we're working towards. I think even with that, and and I can't say, with the situation with the left in Mexico, it doesn't seem like it's at the stage yet of being ready for revolutionary transformation. But I think we can help create favorable conditions for that struggle by our fight against our ruling class here. And I think that's what's important. And by doing this kind of work, building solidarity across borders between the working class and other sectors of the people.
Not sure I have much more to add from what Bill just said. I think he said it very articulately.
Yeah, I agree with Luisa on that.
Well, so we are coming up towards the end of our time, so I'm going to end the Q&A here just so we can give time to our panelists to give some closing statements, reflections on our conversation from today, and ways to stay in touch with you, or whatever else, other resources you want to share, organizations you're part of. Feel free to let people know. And we'll start with Vamsi, and then we'll go to Luisa and then Bill.
I'll just make a couple of broad comments and give more time to Bill and Louisa. I think at this point in time we are very sure that neoliberal capitalism hasn't worked for the world's majority, working people across the world, including working people in Mexico, but also working people in America. And I think, while it started declining significantly in, after the crisis of 2008, it hasn't gone away. And, more broadly, whatever processes emerged after the global crisis of 2008, have not been able to address inequality, have not been able to address instability, in various countries, including Mexico and the US. And they haven't been able to address climate change. So this is the time, I think, the left, including DSA, can, articulate, broader changes, and push against the system itself, which has stopped working. To whatever extent it worked, even that minimal kind of functionality, I think, is no longer there. So this is the time to really push for, major change, revolutionary change in different contexts, whether it's India, whether it is Asian countries, but also Mexico and the US, given, the thematic focus of the panel. Let me stop here.
Yeah, and I'll just summarize by talking about how we understand or how we talk about imperialism, right? That, it's important, and I think we all did a good job of conveying this, that, when we talk about imperialism, we can't just talk about Mexico or Latin America or the global South as merely victims, right? That there's so many examples of resistance against Western powers, against the U.S., a long shadow that the United States has cast on the global South. And so we touched on those things. And I think what's going on in Mexico and again in the global South and Latin America is really, it gives us hope. I do believe that the global South will lead us in terms of, if there's any hope for the rest of the world, it's going to be led by the global South. Right. And so, I did make this clear. I'm not Mexican, I'm Chilean. I was born in Chile. But that doesn't matter, because I know that when Trump makes comments about Mexicans are he's just talking about Latin Americans, right? Most people in the United States don't understand the differences between Mexico and Honduras and Chile and, Venezuela. They probably couldn't tell you those types of differences. So, that's why I am so inspired by Mexicans and Mexican history and stuff like that, because I understand that the global South aren't just victims, that there's so many examples of resistance that we can all learn from, right? So yeah, I'll just end it with that. And I think that Mexico is a great example. And I think that we have a lot to learn from them, particularly in the United States when we talk about left movements.
I completely agree with Luisa, and I as a Chicano, I feel a particular pride in what's going on in Latino America, and I have to say how much, as an activist, I was inspired by the Chilean Revolution, which just had its 50th anniversary. I think that we have an opportunity now. The U.S. left, and I don't want to keep bagging on it, but it's continues to operate in a black-white paradigm. So when it thinks of strategy, it thinks of, yes, we have to build, and they think of the working class as primarily white, and they see the alliance that needs to be built as primarily with the Black liberation struggle, which it should, of course, that's essential. But I think there has to be a real struggle and recognition that it's much broader than that, that our strategic perspective in terms of uniting the working class, of building a strategic alliance between the working class movement and national liberation movements in this country, it's extremely important to understand, and I'm just going to speak from the standpoint of the Chicano people, the Chicano liberation struggle, but there's others, Asian Pacific Islanders and others, that really need to be brought within the scope of our understanding of what we mean by strategy. So I think these kinds of educations are really, really important. And I think we should really continue them. And I want to, again, give a shout out for Liberation Road. If people are interested in that or any of the things that I've written or about my organization, please contact me directly. And the Mexican Solidarity Project. We need more folks. And we're so glad that we're working with DSA and other folks on the left on this really important element of our internationalism. And I'd like to close, if I could, with a poem, if that's okay. This is called Border. Dreaming eyes piercing the velvet dawn follow the twisted shimmer of coiled wire, its cutting sneer snaking along border walls, brown-clad shapes wrapped in the dust and spikes of the arroyo, facing the icy metal of laser-powered contempt. Headlights burn like desert fire, glowing beams sweeping across lands walked by kings. Muffled cries of Mixtec children gurgle like a drying stream searching for ocean's caress. Borders limit trampled by conquest, nature's soft contour soaked in blood. History screams as Yankee arrogance gouges violation in Earth's warm breast. But hope lives, carried on the clouds of children's smile, borne easily on the back of mother's love, lifted high on the shoulders of father's dreams. Migra's iron cannot destroy visions of land reclaimed. Helicopter slashing blades cannot pierce liberation's mystic heart. Politicians' rancid hate cannot drown freedom song, carried on eagle's wings across la frontera que no existe. Thank you.
It was a beautiful way to end this call. Thank you for that, Bill. So with that, that does conclude our session for today. This has been a wonderful conversation. So definitely a round of applause to all of the panelists that joined us and also to our audience who supplied us with some excellent thought-provoking questions to ask our panelists here. I do want to leave us with some of the links that have already been posted. If you're interested in getting involved with DSA or this kind of organizing, DSA is a great place to do that, especially with the International Committee, as Luisa had mentioned. Bill also gave a shout out to his organization. We'll share some links for some of these things in a follow-up email so you have access to them. But I want to thank everybody again for joining us. This has been wonderful. And this will be the first of many conversations that we'll be having on this as we continue to build the movement together. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and have a good one.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much.